parallel, similar fields are talking about the same thing. So we have areas such as World Englishism Form ELT, the EIL blueprint, which I'll explain, and elf-aware pedagogy are just some of these alternative terms. We should also note that when people call for innovations to try to bring classroom curriculum, into the modern age and to better prepare people to use English as a global language, this call isn't new. Actually, it's built on a long history, and I've traced some of that history here. So right from the 1970s, 1980s, a lot of key work in World Englishes calling for a paradigm shift in language teaching to better match how English was used around the globe. We see work in the 1990s, particularly from Brown, calling for World English's perspective that underpins English language teaching. And a lot of this is underpinned by a lot of the work by Raj Gachru, which looks at the fallacies about the users and usage of English. So this is a rich history. While some of these terms might be new, the notions that they're communicating are built on decades of linguistic research. So the EIL blueprint was adapted by Matsuda and Friedrich, and really was outlined of procedural processes that teachers could follow to introduce EIL elements, so English as an international language elements, into the curriculum. Elf-aware pedagogy mainly focused on teacher education. So they saw the core job was to educate teachers about how to be more elf-aware in developing resources and developing their curriculum. And then hopefully then they would bring this to other teachers, to the curriculum, to their classrooms. And then global English as language teaching was underpinned by this framework that I outlined yesterday. And so really when I talk to people about which term to use, my basic message is, I don't care. Actually, so we're having the same conversation. So whether you call it English as an international language or global Englishes or world Englishes, it doesn't really matter because we all have a shared agenda. We all kind of want the same thing. So while each of these kind of come from a slightly different history and orientation and research, actually the central messages are the same. And so I think we're all on the same team here. When we're talking about curriculum innovation, though, getting new ideas adopted, even when it has obvious advantages, and we've talked about obvious advantages, that it requires a lengthy period of time from the time when they are conceived to when they are widely adopted. And this quote comes from Rogers, who is not in educational research. This is just talking about innovations in general. They generally take quite a long time to adopt. And so for this kind of diffusion, which Rogers defines as the process by which innovation is communicated through certain channels over time, this process is quite a complicated one. So for GELT or EIL, innovation in education, diffusion could be defined as the process by which new ideas are implemented over time by members in an educational institution. And so the diffusion model looks like this. So if you're lucky, your idea might become mainstream. And we can follow this with the yellow line over time, where everybody has adopted these new ideas. And usually, this doesn't happen overnight. It happens with key players. And so the innovators come first, communicating their new ideas. Hopefully, then they get adopted by early adopters, and then it feeds into a majority if you're lucky. So in terms of where we are now, where do you think we are in terms of global English's innovation? At what stage?
The majority?
I would put it. Okay, I really do think it's here. It's probably in the grand scheme of things, a small group of highly dedicated people that are really interested in these ideas and implementing them in their classroom. But really, we're just at the beginning of kind of trialing out these new ideas and understanding what kind of impact they have. So we're really just at the start. So anyone working in this area is an innovator. I wouldn't describe you as an early adopter. In terms of who is most important, we can see, the innovators are sometimes seen as kind of radical ideas. They might aggressively pursue innovations in a way that others might not be ready to. Early adopters, roughly representing about 13% of adopters, would gain substantial knowledge about the innovations, but will enact them with greater discrepancy as a result. And so in terms of who's most important, it's actually these early adopters, because they're the ones that start to build a critical mass, but they're also the ones that the early majority might be more likely to listen to, because they'll see the innovators as perhaps too radical in their ideas. And so really our job then, if we want kind of global English's ideas or EIL ideas to become mainstream, is try to convince these early adopters that these ideas have merit. So at the moment, really, we're listening to these innovators. So what have they been up to in terms of enacting these global English's innovations into practice? So this is where we decided to conduct a systematic review to see, well, what do we know that researchers or teacher researchers have been doing in terms of global English's research. And we took a wide view of global English's research incorporating EIL, ELF, and World Englishes. And so through this, we looked at 58 empirical articles that were published between 2010 and 2020, and conducted some critical reviews of them. We had research questions that were what the innovations had been trialed and reported in teacher education, what innovations had been trialed and reported in research in ELT classrooms, and also we had another question that stemmed from technology. So in terms of how has technology been a facilitator of curricular innovation? And this third question came out of the systematic review process, where when we were tagging the different reviews for keywords, we noticed that technology seemed to be one of the key factors. I'm not going to go through all of those papers, but I will just give a snapshot of what of some of the research that's been happening. So in terms of teacher education, we found research happening in 3 different areas. We found studies that reported on reflections, and so they might have been reflections of teachers, but sometimes of teacher educators having trialed innovations in teacher education programs. We had studies that reported on longitudinal interventions, so they might have looked at changes of teacher attitudes before and after a teacher training program or unit. And then studies reporting on frameworks for teacher education in terms of the processes. And this is where we found a lot of ELF studies that kind of looked at that ELF-aware approach. And so I've listed here some of the studies. You can read more about them in the systematic review. But you can see there's a mixture of paradigms that people are working with. Global Englishes, EIL, World Englishes, and also a mixture of pre-service and in-service teachers, as well as different countries, although quite, we see some repetition there with the UK and USA. So an example of one of these studies was one conducted in Thailand with 38 Thai English teachers at lower secondary school. And really the aim of this study was to investigate their attitudes towards GELT, so Global English's language teaching. They were involved in a 16-hour teacher development course, and this particular study involved pre- and post-course questionnaires, research and field notes, and artifacts. What this study interestingly found was that there was no major change in attitudes towards GELT, although teachers had a willingness to learn new concepts. And so a bit of a mixed result there, where perhaps they didn't, this teacher training program didn't have the necessary impact that the researcher originally thought. And so they then recommended maybe a need for activities that provoked more stronger emotional responses to get the teachers to really question their knowledge about English use. In terms of studies in the language classroom, so this was our second research question, we found different studies again that kind of broadly fit into 3 categories. So there were studies reporting on classroom activities. So this was people actually doing something in the classroom, collecting data and reporting on it. Studies reporting on out-of-class learning. So they might get their students to engage in homework tasks, out-of-class learning. I remember one teacher in Hong Kong got their students to go out and engage in real-life English as a lingua franca opportunities, and then reflect on, what they learned through that process. And another one, one that Nicola and I did, especially in a lot of Nicholas classes in Japan, getting students to engage in listening activities, where they selected from a bank of listening resources, where they were exposed to different types of Englishes, and then reported and reflected on those in journals. And then there were studies reporting on teaching World Englishes and EIL. So this notion of raising awareness of global Englishes by talking to students directly about it. And so this was a majority of the studies in our systematic review were focused on the classroom. And so we can see a list of the studies there with a lot more intensive activity later. We're seeing a lot of studies, especially emerging out of the Asian context. There are lots of studies in Japan, Hong Kong and China. So an example of this, of a type of study for this one is one conducted in Turkey, which was involved 30 university students on a preparatory course. What these researchers did was engage these students in ELF-informed activities, particularly focusing on accent, pronunciation, and intelligibility. And what they found through these activities, that students gained greater confidence in their own variety of English as a result, and they tended to develop less attachment to UK and US standards as a result. So quite a positive result there for those researchers. In terms of that final research question of technology, we found that a number of studies that focused on facilitating opportunities using technology. So this was using technology as a tool to bring learners together. So, there might be a situation, and I'll talk a little bit about one later, where English teachers working in, say, Latvia, Italy, Poland, use technology to get students to work together on a project and basically engage in a real project that got them to use English as a lingua franca to complete it. And then we also found studies that introduced students to new perceptions, new ideas via technology. So technology more as a tool of, delivering content. So quite a number of studies fit this category. And again, we can see kind of a mixture of classrooms and approaches. And then an example of this was one which involved students in Taiwan and Indonesia, where they got 58 Taiwanese students and 48 Indonesian students to engage in a project. And the purpose of this project was to help them kind of reflect on how they used English as a lingua franca to complete it. One of the challenges here was that students were put into groups of different levels of proficiency. So the group in Indonesia had lower proficiency than that in Taiwan. And the researchers were quite interested in the kind of strategies that students would develop when communicating with students of a different level of proficiency to themselves. So they claimed through the study that it was effective in showing how this activity can raise awareness and lead to more positive attitudes towards health. So if we take an overview of the study, so I haven't looked at all 58 here, but I can give you a snapshot of the kind of main findings that we drew out of, well, what do we know about what innovators are doing in the classroom? One thing we learned was that most global Englishes research has been limited to a single activity. So often these studies involve students to do one kind of task or activity, or even if it's a series, it's related to one particular thing. And I would group my own, I would say my own studies in global Englishes have been guilty of this too. So really focusing on one element. And a single one-off activity may not result in a change in attitudes towards global Englishes. So there might be a need to look at some kind of more intensive programs that kind of target multiple dimensions of global Englishes innovations. So further work is needed to explore the possibility of implementing various activities in a systematic manner over a class over a long period of time. There are also few longitudinal studies that measure the impact of global English's innovation and language classrooms or teacher education programs. So a lot of the studies we looked at, teachers would give their students an activity, or teacher educators would give their teachers an activity and have them reflect at the end about, well, what did you think of this activity? How have your attitudes changed about global Englishes? There's no real measure or understanding of what their attitudes were before, entering into that program, because a lot of it was collected at one time. And so what I mean by this for a need for longitudinal research, if we just look at the sample of classroom-based research, the longitudinal ones are highlighted in red. And so we can see that the majority of studies haven't really adopted this. In terms of research design, I've labeled this as action research because it's kind of teachers doing something in their own classroom, but I haven't labeled this as longitudinal because we'll find out soon that it's not action research in the sense that data is not collected over time. It's kind of like data collected only during one cycle of action research. So we don't get to see, how ideas and notions develop. So possible areas of future improvement could be that we do lack longitudinal designs, so we need more longitudinal research. We also see an underuse of direct measures to explore the effects of classroom interventions. So often we see a lot of reflection that talk about, well, what do students think, rather than kind of more directly trying to measure the outcomes that we're really interested in. So, and which can be difficult, right? Because it's quite difficult to measure something as nebulous as, students' global Englishes identity or their attitudes towards global Englishes, but it's not impossible. We also see an underrepresentation of context outside of the university language classrooms. So most of those studies were in university level classes. And there's a need for more robust methodological designs which measure the effects of global English's content on teacher beliefs and pedagogical practices, both before and throughout the program, and after teachers return to the classroom. So even in designs of teacher education that might have done a pre and post measure, there's a real need to then follow those teachers when they go back into the classroom and to see whether any of these ideas actually sorry, I've lost my words. Result in any real life implementation. And so some of the questions arising here were these are the kind of questions that I think we need to start asking ourselves. One is, what are the measurable effects of global English's innovations on students themselves, on educational outcomes or abilities to use English as a global language? We still need to understand what kind of tasks, materials, and content have long-lasting effect on students in terms of their beliefs, attitudes, and identity. We need to understand what are the measurable effects of global English's teacher education on teachers' beliefs, attitudes, and identities. And then we also need to understand, then following them into the classroom, how does that influence their future pedagogical practices, if at all? And how can global English's attitudes and identities be reliably and validly evaluated to measure change? So we need better measures of these things. And how can technology be used to facilitate future innovation? And so we have a number of questions that we still need to answer. And some of them we're seeing some developments. So particularly in this one about measuring attitudes, recently we have seen some recent validated measures of attitudes. So one is Natsuno Funada's measure, which looked at global English's orientation, which he validated in Japan and found attitudes to be complex, but at least she's resulted in an actual measure. And another one by Lee in Korea, which was validated, which is called the EIL perception scale, which I think is quite a good measure of students' attitudes towards constructs like standard language, their kind of resistance to or openness to variation in English, their attitudes towards multilingualism. So some headway is being made, and just to emphasize the other areas that we've been calling for recently. So in a recent call of papers for TESOL Quarterly, we've really asked for papers that kind of fill this gap, which is empirical research reporting on pedagogical innovations empirical research on the effects of global English awareness raising and teacher training programs, and also empirical research into testing English as an international language, which was a topic, that wasn't really uncovered in the systematic review, but it's kind of the elephant in the room that we need to really talk about. So we're talking about standards of language, and challenging some of those standards. Assessment practices might be highly related to having some kind of assessment criterion or standard. We need to kind of solve this issue. We also need to think about the methods available to us. I think that probably there's a lot more fruits in these particular methods, conducting true action research in the way that it's truly intended to be designed, as well as more intervention studies. So we would term these as quasi-experimental studies, in that, no, I think it's important to conduct them in the real classroom, right? We can never really have a true experiment. We can try to get as close to it as possible so that we can more definitively say this innovation had a particular effect. And what I mean by true action research is that it should be a cyclical process. So that is that we're planning something, we're acting upon it, implementing into the classroom, we're observing it, meaning we're collecting data on whether of what effect it's had, and then reflecting on it and improving it again. And so it's a longitudinal design that shows curriculum refinement, and we can better then understand what activities work best because we're refining the activities through this process. And so for this then, we really need a starting point, and the starting point are teachers and in a way teacher educators. But these are change makers. So whenever change is to be introduced and implemented, it must first begin with teachers. I think this is why with Global Englishes, we've seen it as a grassroots effort. And one of the reasons I'm kind of sad when I left the context of Japan and moved into academia is I kind of lost my context. And so really, I don't have a classroom of my own now where I can implement ideas and do the kind of research that I think the field needs. And so I think it's up to other teachers that are interested in this to take up that mantle. So we need globally oriented teachers that have a theoretical foundation of concepts surrounding global Englishes, that will be willing to kind of experiment in their classrooms, and more importantly, report on those. And so without these kind of teachers, we're just kind of going to continue, basing our knowledge on the current literature. So we need to drive that forward. This is an innovation model that is based on Rogers, and this is to say that innovation is complex, right? It's not easy. So even if a teacher wants to adopt something, there are lots of obstacles in the way that might cause them to discontinue it, or might cause it not to be more widely adopted within an educational institution. And there are a lot of contextual factors that really affect whether innovations are adopted or rejected. And then also in terms of Rogers' innovation model, and this is something Nicholas talked about quite a lot, is that there are lots of different factors that will affect it. And so one is termed relative advantage. And this is, in order for an innovation to take effect, it really needs to be clear to people adopting it what its benefit is. And so I think, and we heard that at the talk from our colleagues in Germany the other day, that said that basically they're talking to teachers and policymakers again and again, trying to convince them, that these changes are needed. But unfortunately, that work is needed to communicate this relative advantage. Because if they don't see an advantage to it, they won't adopt it. And then there are other elements that really factor into innovation in terms of how compatible it is with different systems. So we might find that Global Englishes might be more compatible in certain types of programs in schools than others. So for example, when I was living and working in Japan in a business school, I found that kind of context was probably far more open to Global Englishes innovations, because all of the students kind of had this understanding that they were going to graduate, they were going to do business with people from India, from China, from Korea. They kind of had a sense of, the importance of global Englishes. You might have more difficulty. I know some colleagues that are looking to implement global Englishes within EAP writing programs in the US. They're doing a commendable job, but probably they're having a far more difficult time in terms of communicating that ability. And probably the last one here that I really want to focus on is observability. And so lots of good work is happening in classrooms, but it might not be immediately observable. Because if people aren't reporting on it, aren't sharing these ideas, then we can't really observe what's working, what's not working. And so I think this is why networks such as ELINET really have a real important potential. If they're able to bring people together that are interested in these topics, they can share resources and say, here are some resources that I used in my classroom that I found really effective. If they're on, the ELINET website, other teachers might be able to, read them, adapt them, use them. And so that will be really key into filling this observability. And just for example, there's, in terms of observability, I just want to end with one of my favorite studies. And this was by Paola Federal in Italy. And this was a study of, and I shouldn't say study, because it wasn't a study. This was an activity that they did with teachers in Italy, Poland, Latvia, and Slovakia, where they got students in school systems. I think it was might have been primary school. Nicola, can you remember this? Anyway, primary school or high school, got students to working in these different contexts together to do this project together. And then through that project, the teacher researchers realized that it was really important in terms of building their strategies to use English as a lingua franca in this really authentic way. They did report on it in a chapter in a book. It's kind of buried in a chapter in a book somewhere, and I think it's probably one of the best studies in terms of what real teachers are doing in the classrooms. And if they hadn't have published that in the study, this wouldn't have been observable at all. So, the fact that they kind of got those ideas out there is really, really important. So we can only assume these kind of really innovative ideas are happening in the world. We're just not hearing about them. I think that's, kind of the key to address. And so really we need people that are working within this teaching research nexus. And so they might be people that are teacher educators that are working directly with teachers, in-service teachers that are being exposed to new ideas, that are more likely to implement them into their classrooms immediately. Pre-service teachers that are being introduced to new ideas about global Englishes that we then might want to see, work with after they go back into the classroom, as well as seeing more researcher teacher collaborators. So we know that teachers are busy people. They don't need to publish. Publishing is not important to them. But what might be important is if they can make connections with researchers that can work on the research side of things, or they can work on the teaching side of things. And these kinds of practices are really actually have kind of come up again as an important topic of debate and emphasis. Recently at AAAL, the American Association of Applied Linguistics, one of the plenary speakers, Heath really highlighted the importance of this and how, as kind of TESOL researchers, we should be doing more with teachers to make sure that the kind of research we're doing is very grounded in practice. And so I think for global Englishes research to really take flight, we probably need to be doing more of this kind of research so that, we can kind of highlight some of the interesting, aspects and activities that teachers are doing. So that's me done. I don't know if you have any questions.